All right, so welcome to the Spring Rose Gardening Seminar. We're glad you're here today on this beautiful spring day. We're going to teach you all about growing great roses in Florida. Got some great upcoming workshops as well. They're all on this chalkboard over here. But in 2 weeks, we'll have the butterfly workshop. And then if you've got kids, nieces, nephews, grandkids, the Easter egg hunt will be on April the 20th. If you want to see the most chaotic 10 to 15 minutes of your life, come join us at 10 a.m. on the 20th. It's a little crazy. The kids find about 3,000 eggs in what seems like a split second. And then we'll do a fruit tree workshop on April 27th. And then make sure that you're signed up for our email newsletter and our seasonal mailers as well. We've got sign-ups over there at the lemonade stand for you to get great local gardening information delivered right to your inbox. So learn all about gardens in Florida from our weekly email newsletter as well. But you're here today to learn about roses. I wish there was some magic trick I could tell you that would take all the time and effort out of it, like just one thing that if you did it, then you'll have perfect roses. Unfortunately, there isn't any one thing. But hopefully I'll give you lots of tips and tricks that you can follow today to make sure that your rose gardens and rose bushes grow really, really well. Roses are kind of notorious for being problematic in Florida. If you probably told someone you were going to plant a rose garden, they might say to you, why would you bother doing that? Roses are so tough, and we hear that a lot. And they don't have to be. So if you follow some of the steps that I'm going to tell you about caring for your roses, I think you'll find that over the long term, they'll be a little bit easier than you think, just as long as you pay a little bit of attention to them and are willing to give them a little bit of time in the garden. But that's why you're here, right? Because you love to be outside in your garden, so what better place than to be out in your rose garden? So what do you think the biggest problem for roses in Florida is? Any thoughts? I heard the right answer, but I'm waiting for the wrong one to come out, because that makes the flow of this a little better. So it's not the heat. Specifically, it's not the temperature on like a thermometer. It's not the sun. It's not our length of day, which is a little bit longer than further north, right? But it is actually the humidity. And humidity is hands down the worst problem in Florida generally. How many of you are from Florida or originally? Transplants from up north. Okay, we got about half an hour. For the vehicle race there. So if you're from up north, did you come down here and say, I gardened really well up north wherever I was from, but I came to Florida and I couldn't do it? Did you ever kind of say that to yourself? So we get that comment an awful lot, and it applies to not just roses, but vegetables and herbs and just your general like gardens outside. And the single biggest problem for all plants in Florida is the humidity. It's what makes us uncomfortable in the summertime, and the plants kind of feel that as well. The heat, that number on the thermometer is one measurement of how warm it is, but then, our meteorologists always give us that feels like temperature as well, right? So it's 95 out, but it feels like 110. And that's makes a huge difference for us in our comfort, and it's also affecting the plants pretty negatively as well. And so if you've had problems with veggie gardens or your lawns or anything else, it's probably related to how humid our conditions are generally. So since we can't change the humidity, we're going to see what we can do to make sure that we have gorgeous roses in spite of the humidity. The first thing we want to do, and it's probably the first thing I say in every workshop, is we want to pick the right spot for roses. In Florida, we talk about right plant for the right place to make sure that things can grow well. So where do we think roses want to be? They want to be in full sun. There's just no question about that. Shady areas are going to be challenging to grow roses in, so we want to pick a spot in Florida that has at least 6 hours of sun. It does not have to be from sun up to sundown. We just want it to be a spot that has at least 6 hours of sunlight. The time of day isn't critical for those 6 hours, but what I would say as a tip is if you have your choice between morning sun and afternoon sun, pick morning sun. It's a little bit less intense, so in that kind of dead heat of summer, the plants will still get plenty of sunlight, but it won't be as intense as the hot afternoon sun. But the second thing that you may not consider for a lot of plants is that morning sun will help to dry up the morning dew from the leaves of the roses. We're humid, and so each morning we find dew all over the grass and leaves and things like that. And so that morning sun will help to dry the leaves of the roses and reduce the disease issues that we're going to have. Because that's probably, since humidity is a big problem, what we're going to talk about later is how do we treat for the disease issues that will inevitably come up on our roses. So the first thing you can do is make sure that you get some good morning sun. That'll dry those leaves in the morning and just hopefully reduce the disease problems that you have in your beds. So we want a nice sunny area. And then the second thing we want is a good well-drained location. We get a lot of rain in Florida. We tend to get it all at once, right? Now here we are approaching April, and we've had very little rain through the month of March, right? And not a whole lot projected for the month of April. That's pretty typical for us. We're kind of dry in the early spring season, and then what happens the first week of June? The skies open up, right? We start getting those afternoon rain showers, 1 inch or 2 inches at a time. So our roses want plenty of water. If you've been at one of my workshops before, you know I'm going to say the word water like at least 100 times, because you've gotta water your plants. But we also, in the case of roses, want it to be a well-drained area. They want to get plenty of water, but they want that water to come on get on the roots, move through, and kind of move beyond, so that they're not sitting soggy or too wet for any long extended period of time. So pick a well-drained area. How many of you have like a real sandy area where you're planning on planting your roses? A lot of sugar sand in Florida, right? Sand's not great for anything, or most things. It drains really well, so that's a good side of it, but it doesn't hold any kind of nutrient up. There's no richness to the sandy soil that we have here in Florida. So it drains well, which is a good thing, but it doesn't hold the nutrients, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the second, how many people have like a compacted or heavy clay kind of soil condition in their area? No? All right, that's not as common, but it can happen in new construction. They bring in a whole bunch of soil, steamroll it to make a nice level space for a house. And so you can get a compacted soil condition in those instances. So if you have either case, you want to pick the sandier soil because it's going to drain well. The basic rule of thumb is that if we've had some heavy rain showers, you want to make sure that the next day that the water is pretty much gone. You don't want it to be standing water. You don't want it to be a soggy area for multiple days. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb for choosing an area to make sure that it's well drained, is that it drains well after a heavy Florida thunder shower. And then the final consideration, which is a little bit odd for plants, but it's important for roses, is good air circulation. So we're humid, right? And that humid air, when it gets really stagnant, is just kind of damp and heavy. And so what we want for our rose garden area is for their breeze to be able to move through the plants. That'll help to move that humid air through. Breezes in the morning will also help to dry the leaves off from the morning dew. And so good air circulation is important. We'll talk about that again when we talk about how we kind of arrange our rose bushes or space them out. We just want to make sure that they have the ability for air to move through them nicely. Like I said, that'll push that humid air through, and it's really good for our roses. All right, so once you've picked the right spot for your roses, that's going to be a full sun area that drains really well. Now we need to pick the right kind of rose. Does anybody know one of the most important words when it comes to roses in Florida? Oh, not floribunda, really close. It's the rootstock. Fortuniana, say it with me. Fortuniana. So Fortuniana is a type of rootstock that's used on roses, and it is the most critical thing for growing roses in Florida. And it's not just me that's going to tell you this. The County Extension Office will tell you this, and if you ask any rosarian, that's a member of the Tampa Rose Society, they'll tell you the same thing. If you find a bargain on roses somewhere, they're most likely grafted on Dr. Huey rootstock, and that is just not a great rootstock for the Florida area. It works in kind of Georgia and some different spots, so it's certainly used in part of the country, but for Florida, it just doesn't stand up to the particular conditions that we have in Florida. So you want to make sure that the roses you're getting are Fortuniana grafted. So all of the roses, especially the modern roses, which are going to be your hybrid tea, grandiflora, floribunda, climber type roses, the modern hybrids, all of those are going to tend to be grafted because they do better grafted than they do on their own roots. And what grafting is they take rootstock from one plant, and then what we call budwood, which would be like cutting a piece off the top of a parent plant, and they splice them together. It's kind of a real exact process of getting everything lined up together. But on most of the roses that we have out there, you'll see a little graft union towards the bottom where the roses were grafted together. And so that rootstock, that Fortuniana rootstock, makes the roses long-lasting in Florida, and it also just makes them stronger for our conditions. They'll produce better blooms, bigger blooms with that rootstock, because they can actually take the nutrients up they need properly, as opposed to floundering on their own root or an inferior rootstock. So Fortuniana rose rootstock is what you want for your modern roses. We'll talk about the different types in just a moment, but just to point out, like knockout and drift roses are typically going to be grown on their own roots. They've just, the complexity of the grafting process doesn't seem necessary for some of those shrub roses, because they seem to do pretty well on their own roots rather than being grafted. But for your cut roses, you definitely want to have the Fortuniana rootstock. We make it easy here because all of our roses, with the exception of the drifts and the knockouts that we carry, are on Fortuniana rootstock. You won't find Dr. Huey at our nursery because we know that to grow good roses and be successful with it, you've got to have those Fortuniana rootstock. You've got to have the Fortuniana rootstock. So then I listed off a few of the major types of the modern roses, and we're not going to go into detail about different types of roses, because what I want to tell you guys is how to grow great roses. And it doesn't really matter what kind of rose you pick, you're going to follow the same steps for all of those. But I'll give you some of the main categories so that as you're selecting the roses for your garden, you'll know which ones make sense for what your ultimate goal is. So the first and most common type of our modern roses are the hybrid tea roses. And those are going to be the most common in a rose garden, probably what you think of first when you think of a rose garden. And those are going to be your really beautiful long stem roses. So when we think of a rose garden, we often think of beautiful blooms on the end of long stems, one single rose, and those are going to be your hybrid tea roses. They come in a variety of colors, a variety of sizes, a variety of fragrances. So the rose breeders are always working to come up with new varieties that have better fragrance, better disease resistance, better color, bigger blooms, all that kind of stuff. So those are going to be the biggest chunk of the kind of the modern rose category. There are also grandiflora roses. You won't see as many of these. A lot of them are older style, like Queen Elizabeth and Gold Medal, I think, are two that come to mind. And you won't see quite as many of those types. But the grandifloras have big blooms, but they'll sometimes be single stemmed and they'll sometimes be in clusters. And so sometimes you'll get a great cut rose, sometimes you'll just get a nice little cut bud from the grandifloras. It can be a little bit of both on those. Then we've got floribunda roses. Floribundas are going to be, I may as well show you one to give you an example. This one's a real pretty one. I think it's called, is it Trumpeter or Hot Cocoa? Oops, Cinco de Mayo. Let's have a margarita, right? So beautiful color on this one, but you see how it's more of a bush rose, and there's smaller flowers as well. So the floribundas are going to be a little bit more like a shrub rose, but they're usually still modern hybrids for color and fragrance and all that good stuff. But they're a particular category that tend to produce smaller flowers, but nice little clusters of them. So they're really pretty in landscapes, not as good for cut roses. Let's see. Another type are the climbing roses. Everyone who's done roses has probably heard of Don Juan roses, beautiful red flowers. They're climbers. They don't attach themselves the way certain vines would, but they just grow in really long arching branches. And so they're easy to attach to trellises, arbors, and things like that to get a really pretty vertical display of rose flowers. So those are your climbers. And then the final category of kind of some of these basic ones are the shrub roses. And those are going to be mostly like your, on your left, some of the drift rose varieties, which are really low-growing roses and very disease-resistant. And then on my left, we've got two selections of different knockout roses, which again are also very disease-resistant generally, and really great for landscapes. Roses bloom almost 12 months out of the year. So as long as we're mild, especially like we were this year through the winter, roses will just keep right on blooming throughout the year. So that makes them a really nice thing to have in our landscape. And sometimes the shrub roses can be a really nice addition for just that bright color in the landscape. Again, not really great for cut roses, but really pretty for color in the landscape. So those are some of the different categories of roses. And as you're picking the roses for your garden, just think about the characteristics I told you for each one there. If you're going for cut roses, you're going to want hybrid teas, and if you're just looking for color, then the other end of the spectrum, the shrub roses, might be appropriate for you as well. All right. So now I've given you a little bit of information on picking the location for your roses and picking out the type of rose. Now we're going to get to the meat of this seminar, which is teaching you how to take care of your roses. So this is the stuff. It's going to take a little time, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And here, as I said at the beginning, that I didn't have a magic trick, like one thing that would make all of your roses grow perfectly. But the one biggest tip that I could tell you to take away from today's seminar would be to pay attention to the roses early on. planting time, in that even to the first year, but especially the first few months of those roses being planted, that's the most critical time for your plants to get started. If they establish poorly, they will never thrive, and you will always struggle with disease and pest issues because the plants were just weak in the first place. But if you treat them really well when they're young, grow them nice and strong, they'll become healthy adults. I wrote it here, it's kind of like people, right? We raise our kids well, they become good adults, right? At least that's what we're going for. So that's what kind of my biggest thing to tell you is to go through that initial period and do that part really well. So now what we're going to do is go through what do we need to do on the first day we have our rows. How do we plant them? How do we care for them in those first few months and beyond so that we grow the best roses we can? So the first thing we want to do is we got to dig a nice hole. Who likes digging holes? No? Who has someone who digs holes for them? I have 2 little girls that like to dig holes in the yard, but they're not really good at doing it in the spot that I want. I need to work on that, get them to do it in the right area. But Abby will dig some really deep holes sometimes. So for our roses, one of the most important things for planting is to use a really good soil. Roses love a rich soil, and how many of you have just rich, loamy peat right out in your backyard? Seriously? Well, you are super lucky.
I work at it.
Okay. Well, you have it not naturally, though.
What do you mean by natural?
Natural, it was there when you just moved in.
Well, some of it was good.
Okay.
But you had to add
You're awfully lucky then. For most of us, it's just we're sit on big piles of sand for the most part. And the roses don't like that. It drains well, which is good. It doesn't hold any nutrients, which is bad for the roses. What roses want is a well-drained soil that also holds some of the moisture back so that the roots have something to get. They need some rich organic material in there so that there are nutrients to pull from the soil, and that's what's going to make strong, healthy roses. They also like the soil to be a little bit acidic. So like azaleas and camellias and gardenias, roses also like an acid soil. So we want to make sure that we have that. Again, we make it easy here at Kirby's. We have our Kirby's pine soil in those cubic foot bags here. And it is a mix of peat, which is going to give you rich organic material, and pulverized pine bark in different kind of grades, which provides 2 things, drainage and a water holding capacity. So planting roses, to make it easy, you can just use all of our Kirby's pine soil in the planting hole, and that's really, really great for growing your roses. Dig nice wide holes. So we don't want to think deep when we're planting roses or any of our other plants, but we want to think wide. So if I'm planting a rose bush, I'm going to dig a hole about 2 to 3 feet wide, but no deeper than the root ball itself. When we actually plant, we want to make sure that the rose's root ball is about a ½ inch to 1 inch above the existing grade of the surrounding soil area. We don't want any of our rose bushes to become the low point in the rose bed. We want them to be the high point so that when we do get a heavy thunderstorm, that water can go through the roots a little bit, but then it also moves away from the rose bush. That way it doesn't collect right on the spot where we have our roses planted. So we want to make sure that they're a little bit higher than the existing soil around there. So you want to dig a nice big wide hole, and then you want to backfill it about half and half. So it doesn't have to be 100% good soil that you add back. We're trying to enrich the soil, and we know that the roses are going to eventually grow some roots beyond what we're able to amend. So they've got to get used to some of what's there, but we want to get them off to as good a start as possible. So mix the soil about 50-50 in the planting hole. As you go in that big hole, make sure you're tamping it down. Remove all of the air pockets. Roots want to grow where there's moisture and dirt. They don't want to grow where there's dry pockets of air. And so that's why whenever we're planting something, we'll kind of use your fist really lightly and push that soil down. Make sure that you get rid of all the air pockets. We're going to water it in really well. You cannot overwater a rose, especially not at this initial planting period. If the soil is well drained, everything you water on it, especially at that new planting time, is going to move right through the soil. And so we're going to soak that whole hole all the way around, and as we water, it's also going to help to work some of that soil into air pockets that we may not see. And so you'll kind of water, you'll start to see bubbles coming up, and that's an indication that some of that air is coming up. You may find that you need to add a little bit more soil after you've done that first good soaking, because a lot of those air pockets may have been found and the soil will have worked into them. So add a little bit more soil if you need to get it back to the right level. You don't want to pile any soil on top of the root ball of the rose. So what we tell people about really any of your plants that you would plant, what you see in the top of the nursery pot might be a little bit of roots, might be some fertilizer, whatever you see at the top of the nursery pot should still be visible after planting time. So you're never digging deep and planting under and burying it under with a lot of soil. You want it to be up and level with the existing ground. And that's especially true for roses because we're trying to make them the high point. We don't want to smother them with a bunch of dirt over the top of those roots that have come to the surface. All right, so now we've used some great soil. If you're doing a larger rose bed, you might think about amending an entire area as opposed to just individual holes. And for that, you could bring in, we do sell our soil by the truckload, by the yard. So if you have an open truck or trailer, we can scoop it out by the yard. And you could spread that over the entire area and work it into a depth of about 12 to 18 inches or so. And that would be for if you're planning on growing a huge number of roses or a larger number of roses. That way the whole area is amended with some rich soil. So wherever the roots grow, they're going to find something good that they want to grow into. So we've watered it in well there. So the roots are really important. That's what we're trying to get developed here. So when I say that initial period for the roses is the most important time, it's important because now is when we're developing a strong root system. If you planted it today, the back of your yard, and then you ignored it for a couple of months, what do you think is going to happen? Well, it's probably not going to be alive, right? But if it does manage to survive your neglect, it's not going to be a sturdy rose bush. How many of you have ever killed a rose and you went to pull it out of the ground? What came out? A big, thick root system or nothing? Almost nothing, right? So in a lot of the instances where our roses haven't survived well, they've just not had the opportunity to grow a really great root system. So has anyone ever had a neighbor tell them that roses are easy to grow? No? Okay. The knockouts are usually pretty easy, yeah. I had social media is always a dangerous place. Off of one of my event posts, someone posted that they always, hopefully they're not in the audience, that I have found roses are always easy to grow in Florida, and I did not comment on the comments. So, but once you get past this initial period of growth and root development, roses can actually become pretty easy. Spraying and fertilizing and watering become more minimal as we move into the kind of second year and beyond. And if the roses have been really well cared for initially, they've got that strong root system, they're very resistant to pest and disease and all kinds of things. So when we go to, if you've ever gone to the Ringling Museum and seen the rose garden, they're gorgeous roses, but they've been there a long time. And that means they've got a really strong root system. Now, obviously, they probably pay people to take care of them regularly as well. But there's so many that are there that I kind of figure that a lot of them are just pretty sturdy because they've developed a really strong root system, and that helps them get past any of the typical problems for roses. So watering, the soil is really important because we need those roots to grow, and they're going to grow into that good soil that holds a little bit of moisture, but that also provides them some of the nutrients that they need. So make sure you're using a good rich soil to plant with, and I'm sure that great roses will follow for you. Oh, so as you're spacing your roses out or picking where to plant them, make sure you do space them appropriately as well. We talked about air circulation and picking the site originally, so we want to make sure that breezes can still get through even once we've planted our rose bushes. So we don't want to cram them so close together that they create a barrier for breezes getting through and creating that air circulation. We also want to be able to ourselves get into the rose garden. We need to be able to check on our roses, to prune them, to scout for disease or pest issues, and just to enjoy them and snip off the flowers when we see them. So for most of your typical hybrid tea roses, which is kind of like this yellow one here, they're going to grow anywhere from 4 to 6 feet tall and figure on them being at least 3 feet wide, an individual rose bush as it matures. And so the spacing should be 3 to 4 feet or so apart to make sure that there's plenty of room to get between the rose bushes and so that they just don't start to block each other out. Too close together and you'll have a lot of extra disease problems over time because they'll grow in together, and that humid air will get stagnant in there and the disease problems can become problematic. So make sure you space them out really well. And after you've planted them with a great soil, gotten them at the right level, you can put a layer of mulch over the top of the root ball. That's important for the roses. It helps to keep weeds down, of course, and reduces the time we have to spend out there weeding. But then it also helps to hold water in the soil. And that's important too for our rose bushes, because although roses are drought tolerant once they're established, when they're younger, they do need plenty of frequent irrigation. So we want to make sure that they get plenty of water, and that mulch will help hold it in the root system so that the rose can take up what it needs to grow both strong roots and a nice bush up top. So now I spoiled my next line because I was going to say it's time to take care of our roses. What do you think is the most important thing? Water. We've got to water our roses.
Question on the mulch.
I'm recording this seminar, so what I'd love to do is take questions at the end, and then I'll answer them for as long as you have at that point. So we want to water the roses frequently and deeply. Those are the two important things. So daily for the first month. And at what time during the day do you think we want to water? Always in the morning. We don't want to water in the evening. That leaves roses or any other plants wet all night long. All that does is create wet roots and rotting roots. By the next morning, that water has moved beyond the root system typically, and so that by the next day, the rose is in need of water again, but you think you watered it. So every now and then you'll have a particular plant and you probably feel like you see it wilting in the evening, so you water it. And it recovers a little bit, and you go to work, school, wherever you go the next day, and you come home, and it's wilting again, so you water it, and it recovers, and you get into this wilt and recover cycle with your plants. That is not a way to create strong plants, and certainly not strong roses. If all they're ever doing is recovering from wilting, then that's where all of their energy is going. And we want the energy going towards growing root systems, growing branches, and starting to get blooms and buds for us, right? So always water in the morning. Set your lawn timers to water in the morning. Your lawns will do better. Everything wants water in the morning. And one of the big reasons is that plants take the water up when the sun is out. And so they need the water in their root system when it's bright and sunny on them. And so that's kind of the timing of watering is always important, especially when we're doing it every single day. So we want to water daily, always in the morning, and we want to water really deeply. And what that means is don't just get out there, spray, 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 and you're done. Yeah, you'll have given the rose a little bit of water, but what we want to do is soak all the way through that root ball and then beyond a few feet so that the roots are encouraged to grow down. And that creates a deep, strong root system. So you guys want to learn a big word? That wasn't very exciting, so I'm going to teach it to you anyways. Hydrotropic. So roots are hydrotropic, or positively hydrotropic, which means that they grow towards moist soil because they know that they can get what they need there. The same way that plants is called phototropic when they grow towards the sun one direction or the other, roots are going to grow where they can find water. So we want to put some water there for them to find. And so we water through the root ball, which is about a foot, and then we want to get water a couple feet below that as well. And over time, that's going to encourage those roots to continue to grow down and find that water. In Florida, water will typically, an inch of water will typically percolate down about a foot in our Florida soils. And so what you want to do is get 3 or 4 inches of water over the top of the root ball, soaking in through that. And what that'll do is over a couple of days, it'll work through the root ball so the rose has the water it needs to survive at the present time. But then it will also continue to keep some of that area below the root system moist, which will encourage those roots to keep growing down. Now you might say, well, if we're watering every single day, why would the roots ever need to grow a little bit more? And so that's where the second month comes in. So in month 2, we're going to move to every other day. We don't want to stress the roses, but what we want to do is encourage them to actually grow their roots a little bit more. So the first month, we're getting them acclimated to their new location with those daily morning waterings. Now we're going to go to every other day. We still want to do the watering in the morning, but now when we skip that second day, most of that water that you put on is going to move through the root system. Now they're really going to be encouraged to grow their roots a little bit more to find the water where it's moved through to a little bit more. In month 3, we're going to go to twice a week, and so now we're just slowly extending that time period in between waterings, and that slowly encourages the roots to grow a little bit more. For roses generally, in the hot season, I like to keep it at a twice weekly watering. Once a week seems like a little infrequent through the hot summertime. Mother Nature's probably going to do an awful lot for you in June, July, August, and early September anyways. So for those months, you may not need to do any additional watering, but just make sure that they're still getting a deep soaking twice a week. In the cooler months, you can probably go to a deep soaking once per week. So once we get to, well, October is still pretty hot, isn't it? November, December, January, February, you can probably get away with once a week. Then I like to start mid-February to late February, start as we start to warm a little bit, bring that back up to twice a week so that we can kind of get those roses flushing out for the spring season. But hands down, almost 90% of the problems that folks call the nursery about with their plants are watering issues or the lack thereof. So make sure you stick to that watering schedule for your rose bushes just to keep them happy and growing well. And it's true for all of your plants. So really what I told you for the roses is true for most of your plants as well. So a second consideration when you're watering is to avoid watering over the leaves when possible. Plants take water up from their roots. They don't need any water on their leaves. But sometimes it's required. Here at the nursery, it's a little impractical. So for our rose bed, it gets overhead irrigation. But at home, it's if you're using the hose, don't spray over the top of the plant. Spray, do it down at the roots. And drip irrigation is a great way to water the rose bushes as well, because it will deliver the water right to the root system, and you can get that set up automatically, which can be really nice sometimes as well. But just make sure that avoiding water sitting on the leaves is important for reducing disease issues generally with our rose bushes. So now that we've watered the roses, we want to feed them regularly as well. Roses are pretty heavy feeders. It starts with the right soil mix. So we talked about our Kirby's pine soil. It's got peat in it, so it's going to deliver some natural nutrients to them. But I mentioned that it's an acidic soil. I'm not going to give you a chemistry lesson, but acidity is measured right on the pH scale. We want a low number, so we want a low pH for our soils for roses, and that's important because a low pH is what roses need to actually be able to pick nutrients up. So if you have an alkaline soil, that alkalinity means that the plant cannot actually pick nutrients up properly. So that's why starting with a good rich soil is really important for those acid-loving plants. It isn't that they want acid, like they don't want vinegar poured on their roots. They don't want acidic liquid. They need an acid condition in order for the nutrients to be picked up. So that's what makes the soil really important. So what we like to fertilize our roses with is our Kirby's Special Fertilizer. It's a custom blend that we've had mixed up for years and years. A tablespoon on them once per month is all that they need to keep growing. And so it's an easy way. Our fertilizer is a complete fertilizer. It's an 848. It's got all of the minor elements in it as well, so it delivers everything that your plants would need. It's easy to do, just a tablespoon once per month, and that'll keep those roses growing really nicely. For my own roses, and we've been doing it on this guy here that's growing real nicely, the yellow one as well, what we do with that is once a week in the kind of growing season, when we're watering, we'll mix in some of the Tiger Bloom fertilizer from Fox Farm. It's a great mix of natural nutrients. What does this one have in it? Well, I don't remember what this one has in it. A lot of times they're made from earthworm castings and kelp meal and different things like that. So we'll mix that in once a week with our watering, just in a hose end sprayer, and then we'll water the plant just as if we were normally watering. So do that once a week in the growing season, and then just once per month in the off season to keep them happy as a great additional feed for the roses to keep them really, really growing nicely. Roses are definitely heavy feeders, and so making sure that they have food is important to keep them growing, especially because what are we doing? We're going to talk about pruning in a little bit. What do we do when we trim roses? We're hurting them a little bit, we're damaging them, and so they need the nutrients to recover from those pruning cuts and as well just from snipping off their long roses, right? We don't think of it as damaging the plant specifically, but in a way it is kind of taking away something they were getting to provide themselves with nutrients. They need to be able to replace that, so we want to make sure they have the nutrients they need to be able to do that. So we're going to water and feed those roses regularly, especially for the first year. I would say is the most critical time of getting those roots growing, getting the bush growing really well to get off to a great start. So then the reason that roses are often considered notorious is because of what we're going to talk about next, and that's disease issues. So it's humid in Florida. Disease issues are prevalent everywhere. We have issues with our vegetable gardens as we move into the summertime. We have issues with just butterfly gardens when it starts to rain too much. We'll see it on citrus trees and mango trees because it's humid here. So humidity causes a lot of issues, and it causes them for roses as well. Probably the most common rose disease is just black spot disease. There's two different kinds, but simple enough to say that it's just a leaf spot disease that shows up as little black spots on the leaves that you can't rub off. So once you start to see those, you certainly want to treat them. And this is the place where, water and fertilizer is usually pretty normal for how we would care for our landscape plants. But often with our hardy landscapes, we're trying to look for things we don't have to spray all that much. But when it comes to roses, if you're going to grow really nice roses, you've got to commit to spraying them at the very least through the humid, rainy season, which is a pretty good portion of our year. Our favorite fungicide, which is what's going to help treat the leaf disease, is liquid systemic fungicide, and propiconazole is the active ingredient in that. And a systemic fungicide absorbs into the plant itself so that as the new growth comes out, it's protected a little bit from those fungal spores taking hold on the leaves and creating that leaf spot disease. Typically, we'll spray weekly in the rainy season and the humid season, and then monthly in kind of the off season. So that kind of October through May or so, you could probably get away with a monthly spray, but weekly through the main summer season is going to give you the best roses possible. So that was liquid systemic fungicide. If you're looking to go a little bit more natural, you may have to spray more frequently, but we do also carry, I want to say, let me double check and make sure it's, well, yes, it is for organic. I was making sure it was listed for organic gardening, but it's a copper soap fungicide. And the difference between something like a copper soap fungicide and the liquid systemic is that the copper soap fungicide, it's topical, meaning that at some point, if it rains heavily, it's going to wash the fungicide off all of those leaves. So that's why we do like to use the systemics on our roses, because it absorbs into the plant itself to treat those diseases. So disease is definitely the biggest issue with the roses. Another thing that you can do is be preventative. The second you start to see leaves that are bad, pick them off and get them out of there. Don't just let them drop to the ground, because that leaves a whole bunch of fungus spores right there in the area. In a breeze like we have today, I'll just pick them up and spread them to your next rose bush. So whenever I'm pruning or deadheading or cleaning my roses, I have a bucket with me that's dedicated to roses. I'll bag the stuff up and throw it away. That doesn't go in my compost, it goes right to the trash, just so that you're getting some of that disease material out of there. And that'll help keep your garden a little bit cleaner. And since I'm talking about it, I'll skip ahead to the pruning section and just say that when you're using clippers, make sure you sanitize them before you prune your roses. That's important as well, because if you're cutting branches off of a diseased rose bush and then you go right to a clean rose bush and make a snip, you've transferred that disease pretty quickly to the new rose bush. So especially if you're trimming diseased roses, you might even sanitize in between pruning each rose bush, but definitely do it before you go to prune the rose bushes in the first place. 1/4 cup of bleach to a gallon of water, and just kind of wash off the blades with that. If you're going to do it in between rose bushes, you can dip it into like a bucket that has that in it and then rinse it off really well. We don't want bleach on our roses, but it'll kill the disease that might be hanging around on those clippers for you. So before you prune, make sure you sanitize, and that'll also help to keep that garden a little bit cleaner, keep disease from spreading from rose to rose. Okay, so we talked about fungicide there and our disease issues. Insects can also be a problem on roses, although not as badly as disease issues are. But we'll see aphids from time to time, chili thrips from time to time. They'll make the buds come out a little bit too small and leaves seem a little bit deformed. And then also in kind of the height of summer, we'll see Japanese beetles. You'll see big beetles like crawling into the buds themselves. So there's a couple of different pest problems that you'll find on your roses. Oop, I didn't bring it over here. What I like to do is, if we're spraying weekly for fungicide through the humid season, once a month I'll add in a systemic insecticide into my spray. You can mix them together and spray at the same time, but the insecticide only needs to be done monthly, because the pest issues don't seem quite as prevalent, or the insect issues don't seem quite as prevalent as disease issues for your roses. But you can mix them together so you're just doing one spray, and that's going to be Bonide Systemic Insect Control is one of our favorites for just good general purpose insect control on our plants. Again, it's a systemic, meaning it absorbs into the plant, and so it treats them the second they start to feed on the plant, and so it can usually keep them away as well. Another one of the big things for both pest and insect control is being preventative. So we get a lot of questions here, we get a lot of pictures of plants that are just riddled with disease or insects. And of course, by the time it's that bad, it can be really difficult to treat and get all of the plants back into great shape. And the same goes for roses. Once they succumb to disease all over, it can be more challenging to get them strong again. Just like that wilt recover cycle with watering, they're suddenly spending a lot of energy just getting a few new leaves back.